but if you do this enough, then certain kinds of internal dialogue rises to the level of, oh, this is God now talking to me. So, and you're sort of coached into recognizing certain kinds of internal conversations as being of this particular gravitas, you know. And this is how the community builds what looks to the outsider like a crazy kind of thing, where you're in a personal relationship with an imaginary being, but this is how it works. And so I would recommend her work, because she's done excellent work on it. Yeah.
Right here.
Hi.
Hi.
As far as religion, you seem to say it's a God, more of a theistic. If we take away the gods, the Christians, the Muslims, the Hindus, and just go with humanity and humanism, to where the power of religion is not in a God, it is in the power of humanity. Humanity really is not considered, humanism is starting to be conceived as a religion, but it's really not a religion. Could you just say about, if we avoid the gods and stick with people and do everything that the religions do, all the comfort, the solace, the support, the nurturing, all of that, but on a human level instead of a supernatural level? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that, of course. I consider myself a humanist, and for those reasons, exactly. However, I would raise sort of two caveats. One is, what I learned spending so much time in the developing world is that the view you're articulating there is a very small sort of option. It's a wonderful option for a very small set of prosperous, privileged people, us. I mean, you look around the rest of the world, they don't have medicine like we have. They don't even have like heat like to fight the weather like we have. There's a sense in which we are in a place where we have the luxury of cutting out the gods, and instead engaging in the cultural activities and social activities that give us those feelings. So I'm a big proponent of, I think a lot of the kind of positive social and emotional management that you get in religion can now be gotten here in Chicago through art. You know, this is why I go see the symphony. You can go to an opera, you can go see the jazz band, go to the Art Institute, see paintings, do art. All of that stuff activates the emotions and glues people together in ways that religion does. But that's not an option for the average Cambodian person. Like when I was living in Cambodia, there were people in Phnom Penh who had been saving their whole lives to go what is essentially like a 2-hour boat ride to see Angkor Wat. And they're like, I'm never gonna make it, I'm never gonna have enough for that. You know, so I hear what you're saying, but I think that that's an option for us. And the rest of the world doesn't have that option yet. They're a long way from that. They don't even have the medical advantages we have. Like, it's very common in the developing world to see people. I remember my son and I were living in China, and we were walking down the street. We would take him to preschool. This was in Shanghai, and on the street there was a woman, and she would beg, and her head was, I'm not kidding, her head was this big. And she was hydrocephalic. She had been born, you know, with water on the brain. And you and I would just get a shunt in the back of the head. You never even knew you had this. You know, it's probably some of the people here had it, didn't even know it, because modern medicine eliminated this as a form of suffering for us. Her family had built a wooden brace to hold her head up so she wouldn't break her neck. And my son was like, hey, there's the big head lady. You know, like, it was just part of life in the developing world. So I think we have to think about religion in that context, in which case I think they don't have a lot of the same options we have. The second caveat I would say is that even myself, I consider myself educated, prosperous, have access to medicine. There are forms of suffering that I have undergone for which I have no scientific alleviation. And I hate to see, you know, people say like, well, religion's the opiate of the masses, or you're only religious when you're in the foxhole. Well, those of us who've been in, you know, the figurative foxhole are like, fine. That's when I got very religious. It was at a moment when, in the emergency room with my son, when science did not know what to do. that's a sort of a human response. That doesn't mean religion's true, but it does mean that secular science has not provided us an alleviation for all the forms of vulnerability that we have. That's the point.
Right here.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for your presentation, which I found.
Is that Danny?
Yes, it is.
Danny.
And as you know, I'm a huge fan of your work, and I found this really fascinating. And my question follows actually very closely upon your answer to the last question. So this argument that religion is necessary for most humans, maybe not all humans, but most ordinary people, has been around for a long time. I mean, it's a classic Dostoevskian problem, right? What happens if people don't have that belief in God? You know, everything will turn to chaos and disorder. Now, the science that you draw on, the evolutionary biology and the affective neuroscience, is bearing out, in a sense, this Dostoevskian anxiety about religion. But my question is this. I imagine you're familiar with a book by Phil Zuckerman called Society Without God, What the Least Religious Nations Can Tell Us About Contentment. Are you?
I haven't read it, but I've heard of it, yeah.
Okay, yeah, it came out in 2010. It's a sort of an ethnographic study, mostly about Denmark. The question is, are we now seeing in very recent human history, societies like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, the UK, whole swaths we're talking about hundreds of millions of people who seem to be largely godless. No religion does not figure in their lives, and they seem to be doing really well on all the indices that you are emphasizing that religion tends to help humans as a species with. So is there a sense in which those societies are culturally or perhaps even neuroscientifically evolving out of these more primal needs that I think your analysis illuminates in a really interesting way? But are there these outliers? Is there a counterforce to your argument?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think I don't know that particular book, but I know that. I mean, I've heard of it. I haven't read it. That argument, I think, is persuasive that Scandinavian countries they score high on the happiness quotient. You know, although interestingly enough, so do some fairly religious places like Bhutan, for example. My own sense is that, yeah, we might be all evolving in a giant progress story that someone like Steven Pinker might tell, where the Enlightenment Project is going to pick up all of these people that I'm describing who are suffering and eventually give them, you know, medicine and education, and eventually they're going to attain the levels of advanced prosperity that, say, Denmark has. I guess my response to that is we're a long way off. That's a promissory note. And in the meantime, religion is the best life preserver that we have. It's almost like saying, this is kind of a bad analogy, but you know, this is why I like, people will dismiss religion as an opiate of the masses, and yet I'm actually arguing let me be careful here, like, I'm not pro-opiates, so right. But I do think that the constellations of religion, and you know, look, you're thinking of opiates like there's an opiate crisis and people are, they get fentanyl and stuff, and of course, bad. But your brain is loaded with internal opioids. You have heroin in your brain, essentially. And life, social life, cultural life is designed to activate it in ways that bring us together. So one of the things we know is that friendship increases oxytocin and internal opioids. And my argument has been that religion does this too. So when I look around the developing world, I feel very nervous about saying, hey, drop your Buddhism, drop your Christianity, let's go whole hog on the sciences, and we'll end up like Denmark. And the reason why I'm cautious about that is that Chairman Mao tried that, and it didn't go well. And arguably, the Soviet Union tried this, and it didn't go well. And having lived in Cambodia, what Pol Pot did was, Pol Pot was like, Hey, we saw Chairman Mao do the Great Leap Forward, and it took like a decade or two. We're gonna do it in like 2 years. That was what they were thinking, the Khmer Rouge. So they're like, let's get rid of all religion. So they basically burned the temples down. They were killing monks. Interestingly, they would disrobe them and then kill them because even the army was so afraid of that saffron color, which means the Buddha. China did this, of course, during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, but in my experience now, having lived in China and Cambodia, Buddhism provides way more consolation and actual help and healing than the kind of purely secular humanism that was on offer at that time. Now, we could argue that that was the wrong way to do it, and that was the wrong kind of secular humanism, but at least we have an experiment. And the experiment, we have a variety of experiments in the 20th century in particular, and they didn't go well. One of the things that oftentimes you do in communist secularized movements is you try to break the bonding of the family so that the individual will then have greater allegiance to the party. And you saw this in China, you see it in Cambodia, it happens everywhere. That is, in my own view, that is never gonna work. That's gonna cause tremendous misery. And as soon as you stop killing people for that, the family returns as the elemental unit of social organization because of the bonds, the emotional stuff I'm talking about. So I wish you were right, but I'm a little pessimistic about the march of progress. And in the meantime, religion is, in its more benign forms, is extremely helpful while we work on the so-called Enlightenment project.
Right there.
In the case of the woman who lost the son, since no one could get inside that woman's mind, we can never know for sure what contributed to her mental breakdown or her recovery. And my question for you is, isn't it possible that religion might have contributed to her difficulty for dealing with such a horrific scenario, in that her belief of a God that not only didn't prevent the horrible killing and mutilation of her son, but apparently it was his will that happened. And I would think that could, I think if I believe that, I would be even more devastated. Isn't that a possibility?
Yeah, that's a possibility. That's a possibility. And that's why I'm an atheist. Because I think the problem of evil cannot be surmounted in my head. So I agree with you, but it is pretty clear that is not what she thought. She thought, as most, I think, religious believers think, that as painful and as horrible as this is, there is some higher good or purpose that God has for my son and me and life in general. I find it very hard to wrap my head around that. I can hear that you do too, but we would be, I think, willfully blind not to notice that other people are able to make that calculation. And that's how they think of it. In fact, that's how they console themselves. In fact, you'll hear this whenever you point out to somebody who's a believer, like, well, look at the Holocaust or something, or this kid who was stabbed to death. You'll oftentimes find this very irritating response, which is that, God works in mysterious ways, that it's a mystery. How can you understand it with our puny mind, For me, it's a deal breaker. But it's pretty obvious that the vast majority of people are able to do that sort of cognitive dissonance better than I can, better than you can. And it's not up to us to say, look at how foolish that is or how stupid that is. They're simply able to reconcile things that I cannot. And so that's what I think is happening in those cases. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really wonderful. I am a huge fan of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to the studies that sort of show that these religious practices and beliefs and spirituality lead to longer life.
Yeah, all I know is just what I've seen in terms of, you can sort of you can Google this and you'll see the same studies that I saw. There's some evidence, it's not like amazing. It's not like people live 20 years longer or anything, but it's like on average, like a year or two longer if you're religious. And of course, what we have there are correlations, and the question is, what are the exact causes of this? So some psychology, as it's developed in the 20th century, is loath to speculate as to why you live longer, because we want hard empirical data that we can observe, and that's going inside the head of somebody to see. But some have speculated that it basically reduces stress enough that you don't succumb to the kinds of diseases that stress tends to accelerate. So that's basically the logic of it, that's the argument. And you see this among other, you can see in certain ethnic groups too, you'll see that people who undergo very high degrees of stress because of poverty or race or whatever, oftentimes the argument is the lifespan is lower. Frequently, it could be a mix of diet, but it also is frequently cited to be a case of too much stress. The levels of stress are too high.
So I'm interested in your take on the religious, I don't know the word for it, that we should procreate and have lots of children, and that because that was once an evolutionary advantage, and today you see this fight over abortion and all of the related things, and we know that we're in a different place now on our planet in terms of survival. So what's your take on that?
Well, there again, I think the idea of reducing population tends to correspond with higher levels of economic prosperity and education. So where you see education and prosperity and wealth growing, you see child numbers, you see procreation levels going down. But again, we shouldn't sort of think in a bubble here about life in Chicago, you know. In other parts of the country, the procreative urge is still very strong. There is this cultural sort of premium placed on having large families, and there's this religious premium on having large families and protecting every kind of sort of conception with regard to sort of anti-abortion and so forth. So I would say that we haven't sort of gone past that in total, like as a culture. We're still very much, I think, as a country looking to procreate. And I also think that if you look around the rest of the world, population numbers are increasing. Like the reason why Islam is oftentimes, you've heard this, that Islam is the fastest growing religion. You've probably heard this, right? No? It's not because Islam is offering people something they can't get from anything else. It's because the population growth numbers are just going through the roof. Like, so you're a Muslim because your parents are Muslim. And if you're having a lot of babies, the growth of the religion looks like it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So I would say at the global stage, population and the pursuit of higher population is still alive and well, particularly in areas like in the developing world. Places like Japan, people are not getting married or procreating. There's very high levels of education and economic prosperity there. So I guess if your larger question is like, we're not cavemen anymore. We have culture and cities and medicine. And I think that has had an impact on procreation. But ultimately, I do think that built into religion, traditional religions of the Iron Age, like the monotheisms that we have, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, is this impulse to procreate. Because, in a sense, religions are, I know this is going to sound weird, well, it won't sound weird to this audience, but religions are, as Daniel Dennett and Dawkins have suggested, are basically like combinations of memes. You know, like in the same way that my kid gets a meme and passes it all around to his friends and we're all laughing at some funny thing on their phone, religion basically has a way of making more of itself. It spreads through a population horizontally and vertically. because it goes out through evangelical means and it goes down through having children. So religion is like a set of means that basically replicates. And the ones that promote procreation replicate better than the ones that don't. Okay.
Hey, thank you for your presentation. You referred to yourself in your talk at one point as an agnostic. And I wondered if there are still any persuasive counter-arguments for you that maybe there is still some organizing higher power.
Yeah, good question. I mean, there's really two kinds of agnostics, right? There's like, I don't know and I don't care. And then there's like, I don't know and I'm really, concerned and interested, and it's a live issue for me. And I'm of that second category. So for me, religion is endlessly fascinating culturally, but also I think the transcendent experience that you have oftentimes in religion is something that I've experienced and many of you guys have experienced in things like the arts, for example. And so that intrigues me. Why is it that there are these very unique experiences where the little ego seems to explode and go away, and the religious mind would say, well, you're having a communion with God, or the absolute, or I suppose the Buddhists would say the nothing. But in any case, it's a kind of peak experience, and it's strange and not like regular psychology. So that intrigues me, and I'm always interested in really more in spirituality as a psychological experience, and whether or not that confirms the reality of things outside of me, I'm sort of less interested in that question. But I'm obsessed right now with this painter. He's an American painter named George Inness. I don't know if anybody knows him. He's not well known at all. But he paints landscapes, and he was really influenced by religious spiritualism at the time, the late 1800s. And I see something in his paintings that looks like that he's captured the spiritual dimension of nature. And I don't know what to do with that. It doesn't really fit with my scientific worldview, so I just, like the song said at the beginning, I just let it be.
Right here?
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. My question is motivated by something I have learned since I've been here in this society. I'm part of the membership committee, and I have been very intrigued by meeting young adults who are curious about our community, who talk about growing up in a very strong faith community of whatever flavor. And one of the things as young adults they realize as they've moved away from that they feel they don't have an internal sense of how to think about right and wrong, or their own sense of whether it's morality or ethics or whatever, that they were given an external structure through dogma and whatever, and once they didn't make sense on your left side of your picture, they were struggling, I think, on the right side. Like, how do I now navigate the right side of all your charts, having given up the left side? And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about, they're not independent of each other, they have feedback to each other.
No, that's a great point. That's a great point. In fact, it reminds me of when I was at the Creation Museum, one of the things because I interviewed the director there, Ken Ham, and when he had this exhibit there, sort of culminating exhibit, and it was like you look into an American home, and it was like it was a diorama, and you look in through 3 windows, and the first window was, you look in and you see like young boys looking at porn and doing drugs, and then the next window is a young girl crying with like abortion pamphlets around her, and then the last window was parents arguing. And then there was a giant wrecking ball that was sort of smashing into their house, which was causing all of this misery. And on the wrecking ball it said, "The earth is billions of years old." And Ken Ham thought that if you think the world is billions of years old, you'll be so bereft of hope that you're just going to start shooting up and getting abortions, and so you're right. Like, they believe that that sort of indicative description of the world as being for them 6,000 years old is what the morality is based upon. And all I can say to that is that I think this is just a category mistake, but it's a common one.
It's real life.
Yeah, it's real life. It's very common, and instead, I don't think your sense of morality and ethics needs to have like a really accurate sort of underpinning story, accurate story. It demonstrates its value in the here and now and doesn't need a universal cosmic picture to make sense out of it, but clearly the average religious person thinks that way. Although I will quickly point out that it's really more the fundamentalist that goes this route. I think the moderate, mainstream religious person is not that interested in these origin stories. They're more interested in using religion on a daily, weekly basis to get through life. So, you know, when push comes to shove, they'll probably say something like, yeah, Genesis, whatever. But, I mean, the average Catholic, for example, has made their peace with science hundreds of years ago. They're not like, well, let's see what the Bible says about the Big Bang. They know, as Galileo said, that the Holy Spirit is not to teach you how the heavens go, but how to go to heaven. That was Galileo's comment. That there are two different domains. The sciences function here and describe the world. Religion helps us with values and ethics. And for Catholics, mainstream Catholics, and I think mainstream Protestants, that's been a pretty good division of labor. Whereas fundamentalists want them back together again.
Okay, we have time for one last question, and then we'll continue the conversation outside.
This is a follow-on from what you were just talking about. How do you think of something like a 7-step program? You take these people that are kind of lost, they're not particularly attached to religion, so then you try to indoctrinate them and get them to move forward. Do you think there could be a humanist version of recovery or answers to addiction? And do you actually think that 7-step programs are essentially counterproductive because there's none of the support that started there? It's all just, you know, indoctrination into here's a group you could be part of and a way forward.
I'm a big fan of 7-step programs. I think that they actually have most of the elements we've been describing here in a way, because I have some personal experience with this in my family. I know that when you're feeling, you know, like you need a drink, let's say, or something, you're feeling weak given your addiction, you can go down to a meeting, and all over in most major cities there's a place where you can meet up. And what you have is something that is highly therapeutic. It has belief structures to it, like you said, and I think many people have balked at the last sort of, well, I've got to believe there's a higher power or whatever. Can't we do it without that? But that's just one of the things that the group is able to achieve, and I think it creates community. It's a loose community, it's not very tight. But it's very helpful in the moment when you need what I think is not just ideas or ways to think, but you need habits that help you actually overcome the craving you're having right here and now. So religion is really good. That's why you have to meet once a week. Like, otherwise religion would just be like, here's a pamphlet, take this, learn the ideas, see you in 10 years when you need us again. No, you meet regularly because religion is, like all other social knowledge, is a result of habit, is habitual repetition of behaviors that rewrite a kind of second nature over your original nature, which you're having trouble with. And that, I think, is something 7-step programs do well. I'm definitely no expert on it, but that's just my take off the top of my head.